Hello there and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section we're going to take a look at timelines, and primarily timelines are used as a communication and presentation tool. A timeline can be a pretty good way of getting a summary of aspects, possibly even all aspects of a project, and presenting them to an audience, perhaps who aren't as interested in the detail of your projects as you are, or certainly an audience where the people don't have or use Microsoft Project. So you want to show them just the right amount of detail of a project, maybe highlight certain points, without going into the sort of complex diagram that we have here for the wedding. So first of all, let's switch on the timeline for the wedding and see what it looks like at the moment. So I'm going to go up to View, and in the Split View group, I'm going to select Timeline. Now along the top of the timeline you have dates, and the left hand end by default is the start date, and the right hand end by default is the finish date of the project. Now at the moment there are no tasks shown on the timeline, and the only other thing shown is a marker indicating today. If I wanted to show some tasks on the timeline, and let's suppose I wanted to show the selecting and ordering of the bridesmaids' dresses, I can right-click and select Add to Timeline. And it now appears in the timeline. And you can see its duration in particular relative in duration to the overall project as well. So let's add another one. I'm going to go to Make Guest List, right-click and select Add to Timeline, and there you can see that one pop up on the timeline as well. So it's a really nice way of getting an idea of where tasks are in the timeline in relation to each other and in relation to the overall project. Having added a couple of tasks to the timeline, it's very easy to take them off again. So if I right click on Make Guest List, whilst I don't have a Remove from Timeline option, you will see that the Add to Timeline little icon is highlighted, so it's essentially a toggle. So if I want to remove that from the timeline, I just click Add to Timeline again, and that will be removed. It's important to recognise that you don't use the timeline in some automated way. You select what to add, and you'll usually select it on the basis of the purpose of the timeline, which, as I mentioned earlier, will quite often be some kind of presentation or summary of progress on all or part of a project. Now, one of the very important aspects of a timeline is that you might want to format it. And if I go and select my timeline, if you look up, we have a Timeline Tools contextual ribbon with a Format sub-ribbon. And that contains lots of facilities, for instance, to change the colour of the bars, or to change the text styles and so on. So I could jump in here and change the colour very easily. I could increase the font size if I wanted to. And that's a bit too large, so I'm going to take that one back, but I'm going to leave it on orange. So I'll pretty much leave you to experiment with those and get that set up however you would like. Now there's nothing to stop you working on the timeline in the way I have it set up here. It's a very convenient way for adding and removing tasks, but you can actually work on the timeline on its own. And sometimes the rest of the display can be quite distracting. So let's adopt Timeline View. And you can do this in a couple of ways. If you right click on the grey bar to the left there on Gantt charts, one of the optional views that comes up is Timeline. But what you could also do, if I just undo that, is you could do the same thing by simply just dragging that divider all the way down to the bottom. And you'll see now that Timeline View occupies the whole of the view. And one of the advantages of this is that you can build up a quite complex content for the timeline without the distraction of, as we had just now, a Gantt chart. And you may think to yourself, yeah, but that's not really very helpful, is it? Because I can't see the task to add anymore. But there are a couple of ways of doing that. With the timeline selected, on the Timeline Tools Format tab, in the Insert group, there is an Existing Tasks button. If you click on that, it brings up a hierarchical list of existing tasks. And if you want to put 2 or 3 more tasks onto the timeline, you can select them and then click on OK. So for example, If we scroll down to, let's go to details and we'll add these three. And there we go. So not only are they added to the timeline, but if necessary, the height of the timeline is adjusted to accommodate tasks that are actually happening at the same time. You could also add completely new tasks. You could add a task which isn't even in the schedule yet. So again, up to that format ribbon, and from the insert group, select task. So I can now go through and fill in the task information dialog as normal. And when I click on OK, it would appear on the timeline and in my project schedule as well. Now, of course, for it to appear in the right place in the project, I may have to select dependencies, I may have to set a start date and so on. But I can certainly enter the details of the task and have it added to both the schedule and the timeline in this way. I can also add a milestone in that way. And I can also add something called a call out task. Now this is basically going to do the same as adding the task, but the task will in this case appear on the timeline as a call out. Now what happens with a call out is that it appears outside the timeline as almost a sort of note. So let's just cancel that. And let's take this task here, register wedding and get license. If I right click, I can display as call out. And there you go, it sort of appears as a call out outside of the timeline as an additional note. Now earlier on I mentioned that one of the main reasons that people use timelines is for communication and presentation purposes. And if you have a timeline like this, then in order to present it or include it in, say, a PowerPoint presentation or send it to somebody in an email, you have a number of options. So again, up to that Format tab, in the Copy group, there's one option, and that is Copy Timeline. And that button has three options: Copy for email, for presentation, and Copy full size. Copy will basically copy it to the clipboard, and then you can paste it in an appropriate format. And the final thing I want to show you here is the main new feature in Project 2019 in relation to timelines, and that's the ability to have more than one timeline. So let's suppose we want to just highlight a particular, perhaps shorter period in the project and add some tasks to that particular period. So let's just say I want to see what's going on between June and July only. If I go back up to the Format ribbon, in the Insert group, I have Timeline bar. And when I click that, you'll see that it adds a secondary timeline. And what I'm going to do is go in and just change the dates to June and July. So right click on the timeline and select date range. I'm going to set custom dates, and I'm going to select the beginning of June, and my finish date will be the end of July. And now then, of course, I could add some tasks to that timeline. I could even take tasks that I already have on a timeline and drag them down to this one. So if I say select and book, and you can see how that displays in relation to the timeline. Let's do the other one, select and order bridesmaids dresses. And there we go. And you can see again, the timeline adjusts vertically as I add more tasks. So that gives you the ability to use multiple timelines. Now, if I revert back to Gantt chart view, and I'll switch timeline on again, I'll see both of those timelines, and I can add tasks to either, remove tasks from either, drag them between timelines, and so on. So that's it on timelines. I will see you in the next section.